The spring morning did not rise in brilliance, but in a weary gray, as if the sky itself bore the weight of winter still. The air was soft and damp, carrying the smell of earth waking from frost, shoots of green trembling against the mud. A cabin stood where the prairie broke against a patch of timber, its chimney sending a curl of smoke upward, fragile as a sigh. Along the road that curved toward it walked a woman in a faded dress, her shawl pulled close, her steps hesitant yet steady. Behind her trailed two children, their small shoes caked in mud, their faces pale with hunger but watchful as birds. Her name was Mei Ling, though no one in this land had yet spoken it with care. The long miles from the campfires of railroad men and the ashes of grief had left her shoulders bowed. Her hair was tied neatly despite its weariness, streaked with threads of gray though she was but 32. Her eyes, dark and steady, carried the memory of both promise and sorrow. She did not move like a beggar though she had nothing. She moved like one who had endured much and asked little. At the cabin door she paused. The wood was rough-hewn, scarred by weather, the handle iron-wrought. She placed her hand upon it, then withdrew as if the wood itself might judge her. Her children pressed close, Lien, the elder at 10, clutching her brother's small hand. Beau's lips quivered though he spoke no word. Mei looked down at them, her shawl falling open enough to reveal the frayed threads at her dress collar. She bent slightly, brushing hair from her daughter's cheek, and whispered in a tongue they had not forgotten though the town wished it gone. Lien nodded. She lifted her hand and knocked. The sound was hollow, 3 quiet raps that vanished quickly into the morning air. For a moment nothing stirred within. Only the sparrows darted from the fence posts, startled by the sound. Mei waited, her breath held, her back straight. Hunger pulled at her stomach, but pride steadied her chin. At length the door swung inward, and a man stood framed by the dimness of the cabin. Henry Clay was his name, though Mei did not know it yet. His face bore the self-satisfaction of one who had never gone without. He was broad in girth, his shirt straining, his beard trimmed carelessly. His eyes narrowed at the sight before him. The woman, the shawl, the children with their dark hair. "What do you want?" he asked, though it came more as a grunt than words of care. Mei inclined her head slightly. Her English was careful, each syllable shaped with effort. "I can cook. I can mend. I can clean. I am not pretty, sir, but I can work, please. My children are hungry." Henry barked a laugh that was sharp as axe on stone. "Not pretty. You got that right. We don't need your kind here. Go back where you came from." From behind him another figure stepped, a woman with a shawl bright against her pale skin, her eyes glinting with cruel mirth. Martha Clay, her tongue as quick as her husband's temper. Look at her, Henry. Thinks she can stroll up and get a place at someone's table. We're not running a charity. You'd scare the hens with that face and accent. The words stung sharper than cold. Mei did not flinch but lowered her gaze, gathering the strength of silence around her. Lien's hand tightened on her skirt, Beau pressed into her leg. Mei's throat ached with a desire to plead further, but she knew the taste of humiliation too well. She bowed her head slightly, murmured thank you though no thanks was owed, and turned away. As she stepped back into the mud, the laughter followed, mean and hollow, chasing her down the path. She did not quicken her pace, for haste would have been surrender. Her children looked up, their eyes asking what hope remained, but Mei said nothing. Words could not fill a belly. From the shadows of the barn not far from the house, another pair of eyes watched. Samuel Hayes leaned on the worn wood of the doorway, a man of 38, tall and broad-shouldered. His shirt sleeves rolled against the morning chill. His face was carved with the quiet lines of solitude, his eyes steady beneath a low brow. He had seen much in silence, and silence had become his companion. He had heard every word exchanged at the door. His jaw tightened, though no sound escaped him. Samuel's land stretched behind him, fields not yet green, fences in need of mending, cattle moving like shadows beyond the trees. He had worked it with his own hands since his father's passing, carrying loneliness as he carried the axe or plow, without complaint. He did not often linger at the affairs of others. Yet the sight of the woman, shawl drawn close, children clinging like leaves to a branch in storm, rooted him where he stood. Mei did not see him. She walked down the muddy road, each step heavier, her children stumbling in silence. The wind carried her shawl slightly, revealing a cheek hollowed by hunger, eyes dim yet steady. Samuel's hand rested against the barn beam, fingers curling as though they might break it. But he made no move. He let them go, watched until the curve of the road and the rise of the hill swallowed their figures into gray. Inside his chest stirred a weight he did not name. May and her children wandered until they found an abandoned shed beyond the edge of the town, roof sagging, walls patched with gaps where light and cold entered freely. She swept the dirt floor with her hands, laid her shawl for the children to sit upon. From her small bundle she drew a cracked pot and a handful of dried roots. Lien gathered twigs while Bo huddled against her. When the fire caught, May's hands moved with practiced grace, coaxing a meal out of almost nothing. The steam rose, thin and ghost-like, curling upward into the gaps in the roof. Bo whispered of hunger, but May hushed him softly, ladling the bitter broth into their chipped bowls. She ate last, as she always did, the taste of ash and earth in her mouth, the memory of better days a wound she did not touch. In the town, gossip stirred. Martha Clay told the story with venom, each retelling sharper, of how the foreign woman had come begging at their door. Some laughed, some nodded in agreement. Mrs. Abernathy, the shopkeeper, shook her head but said nothing. Her heart bent toward kindness, yet her voice was weak against the tide of disdain. That night the prairie wind rose, carrying with it the smell of rain to come. May lay awake, her children curled beside her, their breaths shallow with exhaustion. She thought of the faces at the door, the laughter, the eyes that saw not a mother but a burden. She thought of the miles she had walked, the graves behind her, the thin line of survival that tethered her to each dawn. She pressed her hand against her children's backs, feeling the frail rhythm of their breathing, and vowed they would not starve while she still had breath. Beyond the shed, in his cabin, Samuel sat at his table. A single plate, a heel of bread, the silence loud around him. He lifted the bread to his mouth, but tasted only hollowness. His gaze drifted to the chair opposite, empty, polished by years of absence. He set the bread down. The fire snapped in the hearth, sparks flaring then dying into ash. His hands, rough from work, tightened together as if to keep them from reaching outward. The night passed with its own quiet judgments, and the morning rose again, soft and gray. May woke, gathered the children, and stepped into another day. Each step was burdened by hunger, each breath drawn from stubborn resolve. The road stretched long, but her will stretched farther. Samuel rose with the dawn, split wood with steady strokes, the rhythm echoing against the trees. Sweat ran down his temple though the air was cool. With each strike he saw the image of the widow at the door, the children's hollow eyes. He set the axe aside, drew his sleeve across his brow, and looked toward the road that curved past his land. It lay empty now, but in his mind her figure lingered. By midday, clouds thickened, a hush falling over the land. May gathered wild greens near the creek, her hands raw from cold water. Bo shivered, Lien stood guard, her eyes sharp though her body was thin. They returned to the shed with their meager prize, their laughter faint but real when the pot bubbled again. May smiled then, the briefest curve of lips, fragile as spring's first bloom. From the trees beyond, Samuel watched unseen, a bundle of wood resting against his shoulder. He had carried it there without deciding to. He lowered it silently near the shed's door, then stepped back into the shadow of the pines. May found it later, her eyes widening not at the gift itself but at the thought of unseen mercy. She bowed her head, whispered thanks to the empty air, and set the wood upon the fire. The flames rose brighter than before, warming the children's faces. Lien's laugh broke the silence. Bo clapped softly. May's heart eased, if only for a moment. And Samuel, standing far enough that no one knew he lingered, felt a shift in the quiet within him, as though a door long shut had groaned open an inch. He turned away then, walking back toward his cabin, the echo of their small laughter following him like a thread he could not cut. The prairie evening closed upon them, the horizon a thin line of fire against the gray. Somewhere in the hush of twilight, the paths of a weary widow and a lonely rancher had brushed, unseen yet indelible, and nothing would remain as it was before. The days lengthened with the turning of spring, but warmth was slow to reach the bones of those who lived without shelter. The shed where Mei Ling and her children stayed was no more than a skeleton of wood, its roof patched with branches, its walls gapped enough for wind to slip through. At night the air turned cold, the children huddling against her, their breaths shallow. By day the sun painted the land with pale light, revealing every lack, empty bowls, bare feet, thin arms too tired for play. Hunger became their companion, invisible but insistent, whispering with each passing hour. Still, Mei kept her back straight. She did not speak of despair, though her body ached with it. Each morning she rose before the children stirred, her shawl wrapped tight, her hands red from cold water as she gathered roots, weeds, and sometimes a stray fish if luck found her by the creek. She scraped together meals that smelled of little and tasted of less, yet she placed each bowl before Lien and Bo as though it were a feast. She ate last, if at all. Samuel Hayes went about his chores with the steadiness of habit, but his solitude felt heavier than before. His cabin was strong, its walls thick, its hearth warm, yet emptiness echoed louder in the presence of what he had seen. He thought of the widow and her children when he split wood, when he led the cattle to pasture, when he sat alone at his table. The bundle he had left them had burned quickly, but he knew hunger burned longer. One evening as dusk settled and the meadow filled with the cries of night birds, Samuel walked toward the shed again, carrying another armful of wood. He moved quietly, as if silence were part of the offering. He left the stack by the door, turned, and began to walk back. But this time, Mei saw him. She had been kneeling by the fire pit, stirring the pot that steamed with thin broth. Her head lifted at the crunch of boots on earth, her eyes catching his tall figure in the dim light. She rose swiftly, shawl falling from her shoulders, and called softly. Her voice did not plead, nor did it command. It was a thread of gratitude stretched across the distance. "Thank you." Samuel paused, his back stiff. For a long moment he did not turn. Then slowly he looked over his shoulder, his gaze steady on hers. No words passed his lips. He nodded once, curt and almost reluctant, then walked away. But Mei held that small gesture as though it were a promise. Word spread in town of her presence, carried on tongues sharpened by suspicion. At the general store, Martha Clay's voice rose above the rest. The nerve of her, squatting in our land, living off what good folk throw her way. And Samuel Hayes, too soft to drive her out. Doesn't he know what people will say? Some agreed with nods and mutters. Others said nothing but did not contradict. Only Mrs. Abernathy, bent with years yet firm in her kindness, spoke against the tide. "She's got children," she reminded them. "Hunger don't know the color of skin." But her words fell like stones into a river, sinking, unheard. That evening, Mrs. Abernathy slipped a small sack of flour beneath her cloak and carried it toward the shed. She found Mei kneeling by the fire again, her children waiting silently. The old woman placed the sack in her hands without a word. Mei's eyes widened, tears pressing but not falling. She bowed low, whispering thank you in a voice that trembled like the flame before the wind. Mrs. Abernathy touched her shoulder gently, then left as quietly as she had come. With the flour, Mei baked bread on the flat stones by the fire. The smell rose into the air, soft and sweet, filling the shed with hope. Lien laughed for the first time in days, her voice light as bells, while Bo clapped his hands eagerly. Mei broke the bread into pieces, giving the children the largest shares, savoring the warmth in their smiles more than the taste on her own tongue. Samuel saw the smoke from his fields and caught the faint scent of bread carried by the breeze. Something tightened in his chest, a longing he could not name. He ate his own supper, plain beans and bacon, but it felt hollow, missing the sound of laughter, missing the presence of others at his table. Days passed in this rhythm. Samuel left wood, sometimes meat wrapped in cloth, sometimes nothing but his shadow in the distance. Mei accepted each gift with silent grace, teaching her children to bow their heads in thanks before they ate. Samuel never lingered, but he always watched from afar, drawn by something he could not keep away. Yet kindness stirred envy as much as cruelty. Henry Clay grew restless, his pride pricked by whispers that Samuel might be shielding the widow. He spoke loudly in town, that no decent man would harbor such as her, that Samuel Hayes was losing his sense. Martha echoed him, painting pictures of disgrace and shame, her laughter sharp as knives. Samuel heard the talk but answered with silence. He had long ago learned that words spent carelessly were like arrows without aim. He tended his fields, mended his fences, worked with the steadiness of one who owed nothing to rumor. But in the quiet of night, when firelight painted the walls, he found his thoughts returning to the shed, to the children's thin faces, to the widow's bowed head and steady hands. One evening rain fell heavy, the roof of the shed dripping steadily, puddles gathering on the dirt floor. May wrapped her children in her shawl, her body shielding them from the damp. Lien pressed her cheek against her mother's arm. Bo whimpered in his sleep. May stared at the leaking roof, her breath steady despite the fear pressing in her chest. She wondered how long before sickness came, how long before strength failed. Outside, Samuel passed by, his lantern swinging. He saw the thin line of smoke faltering from the shed, heard the cough of the boy through the rain. He stood still for a long time, rain soaking his hair, his shirt clinging to his chest. His hand clenched around the lantern handle. At last he set it down, turned, and walked back toward his cabin, his jaw tight as stone. The next morning the rain had passed, the air smelling of wet earth and new grass. May stepped outside, her shawl heavy with damp, her children coughing softly. At the door she found another gift, not just wood this time, but a small blanket, worn but clean, folded carefully. Her breath caught, her eyes closing as she pressed it to her chest. She knew whose hand had left it. She did not speak of it to her children, but that night when she laid the blanket over them, she whispered into the dark a prayer not for herself but for the man whose silence had given them warmth. In the town the whispers sharpened, the prejudice hardening. Martha Clay spat that Samuel had lost his senses, that he would bring shame to the settlement. Henry muttered of driving the widow out by force. But others began to hesitate. They saw the children playing weakly in the meadow, their laughter faint but real. They saw May's steady work gathering roots, her quiet dignity. Doubt gnawed at their certainty. For Samuel, each day brought a deeper weight. He could not forget the image of May kneeling by the fire, her hands shaping bread from almost nothing, her face lit with resolve. He had known loneliness, but he had never known resilience like hers. It stirred something unmovable inside him, something that neither words nor silence could fully contain. The season deepened, the fields brightening with young shoots, the air alive with the hum of bees. Life returned to the land, but for May and her children survival remained fragile. Still, there was a shift, the fire brighter, the bread sweeter, the days a little less hollow. Samuel's quiet hand had tipped the scale, though he spoke nothing of it. One evening, as twilight bled into night, Samuel stood at the edge of the trees watching the shed. May knelt with her children, their faces lit by firelight, their laughter rising faintly through the dusk. She looked up suddenly, her gaze sweeping the darkness, as if she felt his presence. Their eyes met across the distance, hers filled with gratitude, his steady and unreadable. Neither spoke. Yet something passed between them, unshaped by words, as sure as the turning of seasons. Samuel turned away at last, walking back toward his cabin, his lantern swinging low. But the silence within him had shifted again, a door opening wider, the weight of choice pressing nearer. In the shed, May lay awake long after her children slept, listening to their breathing beneath the blanket. She thought of the man's eyes in the darkness, steady as the earth itself. For the first time in many months, she felt the faint stir of hope, fragile as ash, yet glowing as ember. And as the night deepened, the prairie held its breath, as though waiting for what would come next. The storm rolled in with little warning, sweeping across the prairie like a hand erasing light from the sky. Clouds stacked thick and dark, winds bent the grasses low, and the first drop struck the shed's sagging roof with hollow percussion. Mei Ling pulled her children close, her arms a frail wall against the rain that seeped through every gap. The fire sputtered, smoke stinging their eyes, the floor slick beneath them. Bo whimpered, coughing, and Lien tried to steady him though she shivered herself. Mei whispered that it would pass, that storms always passed, but the words trembled like paper in the wind. The roof sagged further, water dripping steadily onto the pot, turning their meager stew into thin bitterness. Mei pressed her palm against the beam, as if her small hand could hold back the weight of heaven itself. She felt her strength faltering. For the first time since they had arrived, fear broke through her composure. She had endured hunger, endured laughter and scorn, endured the emptiness of nights, but she could not shield her children from the sky collapsing over them. Through the roar of rain came another sound, heavy boots in the mud. A lantern swung into view, its glow catching the torrent in shards of gold. Samuel Hayes stood at the threshold of the shed, his broad shoulders wet with rain, hair plastered to his brow, his jaw set like stone. His eyes swept over the scene, the fire choking, the roof sagging. May crouched low with her children clutched against her. He said nothing, but his presence filled the hollow space with something solid. Without asking, he stooped, lifted Bo into his arms. The boy startled but did not cry. Samuel motioned to Lien with a nod, his eyes steady, and she obeyed without hesitation, rising to follow. May stood last, her shawl soaked through, her heart torn between pride and relief. She did not resist when Samuel gestured for her to come. He turned and stepped into the storm, carrying the boy as though the weight were nothing. They crossed the meadow through mud and water, lantern light flickering against sheets of rain. Samuel led them to his cabin, its walls stout against the wind, firelight already flickering behind the shutters. He shouldered the door open, set Bo gently near the hearth, and motioned the others inside. The warmth met them at once, wrapping around their soaked bodies, the scent of wood smoke and bread lingering in the air. For a moment May stood just within the doorway, dripping onto the floorboards, unsure if she had crossed into mercy or judgment. Samuel took her shawl without asking, hanging it on a peg by the fire. His hands were rough, but his movements were careful, almost reverent. May guided Lien closer to the flames, rubbing her arms briskly to stir warmth into her bones. Bo leaned against the hearthstone, eyes heavy with exhaustion. Samuel stoked the fire higher, the light spilling across the room, painting his face in bronze. May's eyes wandered over the cabin. Solid beams, shelves lined with jars, a table set with 2 chairs, one polished smooth with use. The emptiness of her shed felt like another world entirely. She turned back to her children, smoothing their hair, murmuring soft words in her mother tongue. The firelight caught her cheekbones, hollow yet dignified, her posture bent with fatigue but not defeat. Samuel moved to the table, drawing out bread from a cloth. He cut it thick, setting slices onto tin plates. The smell rose warm and hearty, filling the cabin with promise. He placed the plates before the children first, then one before May. She hesitated, her hands hovering as though afraid to accept. Samuel simply nodded once, then sat at the far side, his own plate untouched until she took hers. The first bite brought tears to her eyes, though she hid them quickly, swallowing with dignity. Lien ate eagerly, Bo more slowly, savoring each mouthful. May broke her piece in half, sliding the larger portion to her children without Samuel seeing. But he did see. His eyes caught the movement, though he said nothing, only lowering his gaze to his own bread. Silence stretched, but it was not empty. The crackle of fire, the soft clink of plates, the children's faint laughter, it filled the room with a kind of fragile peace. May's shoulders eased for the first time in weeks. She did not know if she was guest or intruder, but for this moment her children were warm, their bellies full, and that was enough. Days followed with a new rhythm. Samuel returned from his fields to find the fire already lit, stew simmering in the pot, the cabin carrying scents it had not known in years. May moved quietly, sweeping floors, mending shirts, tending to the hearth. She spoke little, but her presence softened the hard edges of the space. Lien helped her, eager with small tasks, while Bo often followed Samuel to the barn, watching wide-eyed as he fed the cattle or chopped wood. Samuel spoke rarely, but his silence was not harsh. It was the silence of a man who had long lived alone and now listened to sounds he did not know he had missed. He watched as May's hands shaped dough, precise and graceful even with little to work with. He saw how she tucked the blanket tighter around her children each night, her gaze lingering on them as though nothing else mattered. Something within him stirred, an ache, a recognition, a longing unnamed. The town noticed quickly. Martha Clay's voice cut sharp as she spread her venom. That widow's moved into Samuel's cabin now. Mark my words, it'll be the ruin of him. Henry nodded, muttering of disgrace, whispering of danger. Others listened, some agreeing, some uneasy. Mrs. Abernathy alone refused to join their bitterness, though even she could not silence the tide. When Samuel came to the store, Martha sneered openly, asking if he meant to take in every stray who knocked on his door. Samuel looked at her once, his gaze so steady it stripped the mockery from her tongue. He said nothing, placed his coins on the counter, and left. Silence had always been his shield, and it served him still. But May heard the whispers when she walked the road. Women turned their backs, men stared too long, children pointed. She held her chin high, guiding Lien and Bo close, but inside she felt the weight of judgment pressing heavy. She feared she was bringing shame to the man who had shown her kindness, feared her presence would become a burden too great. One evening, after the children had slept, she sat by the fire with Samuel's shirt in her hands, mending a tear along the seam. Her stitches were neat, her movements steady, but her mind trembled. Samuel sat nearby, sharpening his knife, the scrape of stone against steel loud in the hush. At length he looked up, watching her hands. "You don't have to," he said quietly. She paused, her eyes meeting his. Her voice was soft, shaped by accent but clear. "Work gives me strength. To care for what feeds us. It makes me less afraid." Samuel held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded once, returning to his blade. But something had shifted, as though a wall within him had cracked. Another storm came days later, wind rattling the shutters, rain pelting hard. Yet this time, warmth filled the cabin. May stirred stew over the fire, humming faintly under her breath, a tune soft and unfamiliar yet comforting. Lien swept the floor, Bo carved at a stick with Samuel's guidance. The storm outside roared, but within there was steadiness, as though the cabin itself had grown stronger with their presence. Later, when the storm eased, Henry Clay arrived at the door, mud clinging to his boots, his face twisted with disdain. "Word is, you've got yourself company, Samuel." He looked past him toward May, who stood frozen near the hearth, her children clutching at her skirts. Henry spat on the floorboard. "She don't belong here. None of them do." Samuel rose slowly, his height dwarfing the doorway. His voice, when it came, was low but carried weight. "Leave." Henry sneered, but when Samuel took a single step forward, shoulders squared, silence as firm as iron, he faltered. Muttering, he turned back into the rain, his pride bruised but his tongue silenced. May's hands trembled as she gathered her children, her heart pounding. She wanted to speak, to say she would go, to spare him the trouble. But when she turned, Samuel was already seated again, as though nothing had passed. His eyes flicked to hers only briefly, but in that glance she saw something unyielding, a choice he had already made, though unspoken. That night, May lay awake, the children breathing softly beside her. She stared at the rafters, listening to the steady crackle of fire. Fear still whispered, but beneath it something else stirred, safety. Fragile, perhaps temporary, but real enough to steady her heartbeat. And as the flames dwindled, she realized her fear was no longer only of hunger or cruelty. It was of hope itself, of daring to believe she might have found a place where her children could belong. Outside, the wind carried the town's whispers, but within the cabin a different truth had taken root, fragile as a seed in spring soil, waiting for its chance to grow. The thaw of spring spread across the prairie, the earth soft beneath boot and hoof, the sky open and pale with promise. Young grass rose from the soil, fresh and green, and streams once choked with ice now sang with clear water. But peace in the land did not mean peace among those who dwelled upon it. Whispers in town had grown louder, curling like smoke beneath doors and stirring like embers in restless hearts. Each time Mei Ling walked the road, eyes followed her, lips tightened, and voices dropped to hush. Children stared, women turned away, men muttered of impropriety. May bore it in silence, though inside she feared her presence was breaking Samuel's place among his own. She kept the cabin clean, the fire fed, the children quiet, as if invisibility might shield them from scorn. Samuel, however, moved as he always had, steady, deliberate, unyielding. His work filled the fields, his silence carried weight. Yet something in his posture had changed. Where once he bent alone beneath labor, now he stood taller, as though carrying more had given him strength. One afternoon, Martha Clay caught May at the well. Her voice rang sharp as iron, her words laced with venom. "You think kindness makes you belong? You think feeding a man means you're his wife? Shame on you, woman. Shame on him for letting you in." May bowed her head, gathering her water in silence, her cheeks burning though her hands remained steady. She would not give the woman her pain. Yet that night by the fire, she nearly told Samuel she would leave. The words rose to her lips, but when she saw him seated with bow curled against his side, the boy's small fingers resting on his broad hand, her voice faltered. She swallowed the words, burying them like seeds too fragile to grow. The tension came to breaking when Henry Clay gathered others, his voice swelling with anger. He claimed Samuel Hayes had betrayed their town, that he sheltered those who did not belong, that he was a fool blinded by weakness. A handful listened with nods, others with silence, but enough stirred that they came together one evening, their boots trampling the wet earth, their faces set with certainty, their voices sharpened by rumor. They marched toward the cabin, lanterns swinging, the prairie lit by their restless fire. Inside, May felt it before she heard it, the shift of the wind, the sound of boots heavy in the mud. She looked at her children, their eyes wide with fear. She gathered them close, her heart pounding, her hands trembling though she kept her face calm. The door shook with a knock, not of request but of demand. Samuel rose, his frame filling the space, his shoulders broad against the firelight. He moved to the door, his step steady, his face carved in silence. When he opened it, the night flared with lanterns and the crowd beyond. Henry Clay stood at the front, his face flushed, his chest heaving with self-importance. "We're here to end this foolishness, Samuel," he barked. "She don't belong here. None of them do. Send them off before they shame you further." Samuel's gaze swept over them, slow and steady, like a river too deep to be read. His silence unsettled them, for it held no fear. Henry spat into the mud, gesturing toward the cabin. "Do you mean to marry her, then? To call her yours? Think of the disgrace, man. Think of the town." Behind Samuel, May clutched her children, her breath caught in her throat. She thought then of stepping forward, of sparing him by leaving, of walking into the night with nothing but her children's hands in hers. But before she could move, Samuel stepped onto the threshold. His voice, when it came, was low, steady, and carried through the night like iron striking stone. "She and her children will not leave." The crowd shifted, murmurs rising. Henry sneered, his bluster loud. "You'd stand against us all for her? For a woman cast aside by her own? For children that aren't yours?" Samuel's jaw tightened. He did not shout, did not argue. He simply looked at Henry, his eyes unblinking, his shoulders set. One step forward, and the air changed. The men behind Henry wavered, their resolve cracking under the weight of a silence stronger than any words. The prairie wind swept between them, carrying away bravado, leaving only unease. Martha's voice rang from behind, shrill and cutting. "You'll ruin yourself, Samuel Hayes. You'll bring nothing but shame." Samuel's gaze flicked toward her, then back to Henry. He spoke again, his words few but final. "Better shame than cowardice." The silence that followed was heavier than the storm that had driven May from her shed. Lanterns flickered, boots shifted, but no one stepped forward. Henry's face twisted, his pride warring with fear, but even he could not withstand the quiet certainty before him. One by one, shoulders dropped, eyes fell, murmurs replaced anger. The fire in their march dwindled to smoke. At last, muttering curses, Henry turned away, the crowd dissolving into the night, their footsteps fading into the damp earth. Samuel closed the door slowly, the latch falling into place with a sound final as judgment. He stood still for a moment, his back to the room, his breath steady though his hands were clenched at his sides. May watched him, her heart caught between awe and fear, her body trembling though the danger had passed. She whispered softly, her voice unsteady, "I should go, before they come again." Samuel turned then, his eyes meeting hers. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, until he stood before her. Without words, he reached for her hand. His touch was rough, calloused, yet steady as stone. He held it before the fire, his eyes unyielding, his silence deeper than any vow. The children watched, their breaths held. Lien's eyes widened, Bo leaned closer against his mother. May felt her knees weaken, not from fear but from the weight of what passed in that moment. A man had chosen to stand, not for pride, not for show, but for her and the children who bore no claim to his name. Tears slipped down her cheeks, though she did not bow her head this time. She let them fall, her hand trembling in his but not pulling away. The fire crackled, casting their joined hands in gold. The cabin, once filled only with silence, now held something greater, a stillness alive with promise, fragile but unbreakable. The storm of judgment had come to their door, and still they stood together. Outside, the prairie night lay quiet, the grass bent by wind, the sky wide and pale with stars. Inside, the widow and the rancher, the children and the fire, had bound themselves with no need for words. The town's whispers would not cease, the road ahead would not be smooth, but the choice had been made. And as the flames leapt higher, May looked at Samuel, her voice breaking the hush with a truth that could no longer be swallowed. "We are home." The words trembled into the air, fragile as spring's first blossoms, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. Samuel's gaze did not falter, and in his silence she heard his answer, firm as the earth beneath their feet. Beyond the walls, the prairie carried the last traces of the crowd's retreat, their lanterns gone, their anger spent. But within, a fire had been kindled that no storm could quench.